August 17, 1943, 27,000 feet above Schweinfurt, Germany, the B-17 F. Memphis Belle lurched violently as an 88mm shell detonated 30 feet off the port wing. Captain Robert Morgan felt a concussion through the control column, watched black smoke bloom across his windscreen, and heard his ball turret gunner call out another burst tracking toward them from 10 o'clock. The formation tightened instinctively. 230 flying fortresses, holding their geometric pattern as German flak batteries, threw up a wall of steel fragments that turned the sky into a killing field. Morgan's co-pilot, Captain Jim Varinis, kept his eyes on the manifold pressure gauges as the No. 3 engine coughed, caught, then steadied. Behind them, through 800 miles of hostile airspace, lay the English Channel. Ahead, through 5 more minutes of this barrage, lay the ball-bearing plants that kept the Third Reich's war machine turning. What the Luftwaffe pilots watching from Schweinfurt's airfields didn't know, what they couldn't have predicted from their initial encounters with American daylight bombing, was that they were witnessing the beginning of a fundamental shift in aerial warfare. The ungainly, slab-sided bombers absorbing punishment above them represented something new, an aircraft designed not to avoid damage, but to survive it. And over the next 18 months, that capability would rewrite the rules of strategic bombing and force the Luftwaffe into a war of attrition it couldn't win. But that understanding came slowly, paid for in blood and wreckage across the skies of occupied Europe. When the first American B-17s arrived in England in July 1942, Luftwaffe pilots viewed them with something approaching contempt. The German fighter community had spent 3 years perfecting tactics against the RAF's night bombing campaign, and they'd learned to respect the speed and maneuverability of British light bombers like the Mosquito. But the American approach, massive, slow, heavily loaded bombers flying in daylight formation, seemed to violate every principle of survival over defended territory. At the fighter bases around Bremen and Wilhelmshaven, where the first American raids struck, Luftwaffe pilots exchanged sardonic observations. The B-17s flew straight and level during their bomb runs, making no evasive maneuvers. They were large targets, easy to track, predictable in their approach corridors. And they operated without fighter escort beyond 200 miles from England, which meant German interceptors could attack them with near impunity once they crossed into the Netherlands. Major Egon Mayer, commanding 2nd JG-2, watched the first formations approach his sector in August 1942, and reportedly told his pilots, "They fly like training targets." His initial assessment reports noted the bombers' defensive armament, but expressed confidence that determined frontal attacks would break up the formations and send them fleeing back to England. The early engagement seemed to confirm this assessment. On August 17, 1942, exactly 1 year before the mission that would begin changing minds, a dozen B-17s struck the Rouen-Sotteville marshalling yards. Luftwaffe fighters damaged several bombers, forced one to ditch in the channel, and concluded that American daylight bombing was a manageable threat. The fortresses were well armed, certainly, with up to 13.50 caliber machine guns covering different approach angles. But they were also slow, with a maximum speed of 287 miles per hour at altitude, which meant fighters could position for optimal attack runs. And they carried bomb loads of only 4,000 to 6,000 pounds on deep penetration missions, which seemed modest compared to the punishment German cities had absorbed from RAF night raids. The mockery intensified through late 1942 and into early 1943. Luftwaffe tactical bulletins from the period contain dismissive language about American bomber formations, focusing on their inflexibility and vulnerability to coordinated attacks. The Germans had developed effective tactics against the RAF, individual night fighters using radar and skilled flying to intercept isolated bombers in darkness. Against the Americans, they could mass entire Jagdgeschwader, fighter wings, for daylight interceptions, putting 40 to 60 fighters against formations that initially numbered only 50 to 100 bombers. The mathematics seemed favorable. Attack from 12 o'clock high straight through the formation at 400 miles per hour closing speed. Fire a 3-second burst at convergence point. Break away underneath. Repeat until the bombers turned back or fell from the sky. Simple, brutal, and apparently effective. What they didn't fully understand yet was what Boeing's engineers had built into the B-17's fundamental structure, and what American. Bomber crews would prove about human endurance under fire. The B-17 Flying Fortress emerged from Boeing's Seattle plant with a design philosophy that prioritized survivability over performance. While German bombers like the Heinkel He-111 emphasized speed and the British Lancaster optimized for maximum bomb load, Boeing's engineers built redundancy into every critical system. The B-17F, the variant flying most missions in 1943, had 4 1,200 horsepower Wright R 1820 Cyclone engines. Lose one engine, and the aircraft could maintain altitude and formation position. Lose 2 engines on the same wing, and an experienced crew could still coax it home, though the flight back would test every skill they possessed. The fuel system distributed gasoline across multiple self-sealing tanks, a technology the Germans had pioneered but which American engineers refined to survive repeated hits. A single 20-millimeter cannon shell striking a fuel tank would penetrate, yes, but the rubber coating would swell on contact with fuel and seal around the hole, containing the leak before it could drain the tank or create a vapor explosion. The control systems ran through multiple cable paths. If shrapnel severed the primary elevator cables, backup cables could still provide pitch control. If hydraulics failed, pilots could lower the landing gear manually with a hand crank. A brutal, exhausting process, but one that could save the aircraft and crew. The electrical system was distributed across 4 generators, 1 on each engine, with battery backup. The Boeing engineering team had studied every bomber loss in the first year of European combat, cataloging failure modes and adding redundancy wherever weight budgets allowed. The result was an aircraft that weighed 65,000 pounds fully loaded, heavy enough to absorb damage that would destroy lighter designs, but not so heavy it couldn't maintain formation at 25,000 feet. The defensive armament evolved rapidly in response to Luftwaffe tactics. Early B-17E and F models mounted 10.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, waist guns, top turret, ball turret, tail position, and single guns in the nose and radio room. But frontal attacks by German fighters exposed a critical weakness: inadequate forward firepower. A Focke-Wulf 190, attacking from 12 o'clock, faced only a single .50 caliber in the nose compartment, often fired by the bombardier, who had other responsibilities during the bomb run. Luftwaffe pilots quickly exploited this vulnerability, boring in head-on at closing speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour, firing their 20mm cannons and 13mm machine guns into the cockpit and nose section, then breaking away before the bomber's dorsal and waist guns could track them effectively. The response arrived in the B-17G variant, which entered service in September 1943. The G model added a chin turret beneath the nose mounting twin 50-caliber guns, controlled remotely by the bombardier. It also added cheek guns, single .50 caliber positions on each side of the nose compartment, giving the bombardier and navigator hand-operated weapons to engage frontal attacks. Total defensive armament increased to 13 guns, and more importantly, the coverage zones overlapped to create interlocking fields of fire. A fighter attacking from directly ahead now faced 4.50 caliber guns. The chin turret and both cheek guns putting approximately 200 rounds per minute of .50 caliber fire into the approach corridor. That changed the mathematics considerably. A .50 caliber round striking a FW-190's engine could shatter cylinders and start fires. A hit on the cockpit could kill or wound the pilot. The frontal attack, which had been nearly risk-free in early 1943, became a calculated gamble by late in the year. But the real genius of the B-17's design wasn't any single system. It was how those systems worked together to keep damaged aircraft flying. The four-engine layout meant redundant power. The distributed control systems meant battle damage had to be catastrophic to render the aircraft uncontrollable. The robust structure meant it could absorb dozens of hits and still hold together. And the self-sealing tanks, armor plate, and redundant electrical systems meant that damage which would doom other aircraft might be survivable in a fortress. Luftwaffe pilots would learn this lesson mission by mission, watching bombers they thought they'd killed somehow remain in formation, somehow make it back to England, somehow land with damage that should have been instantly fatal. The first missions were probing actions, small formations testing German defenses, learning the operational realities of daylight precision bombing. On August 19, 1942, 12 B-17s from the 97th Bomb Group struck the Abbeville-Drucat airfield in occupied France. Luftwaffe. Fighters rose to meet them, and the engagement that followed established patterns that would persist for months. The German pilots attacked from the sides and rear, where their training and experience lay. They'd learned against the RAF that stern attacks allowed the longest firing time, and their tactics assumed bombers would take evasive action, diving, turning, breaking formation to escape. But the Americans didn't break. The formations held rigid geometry, and as fighters closed to firing range, they encountered something unexpected: concentrated defensive fire from multiple bombers simultaneously. The B-17's .50 caliber Browning could reach out to 1,000 yards effectively, much farther than German pilots expected. And when 4 or 5 bombers focused fire on a single attacker, the volume of tracers could be psychologically overwhelming, even when hit probability remained low. Hauptmann Heinz Knocke, flying Bf-10-9s with JG-1, recorded his impressions of early engagements in his combat diary. The American bombers maintain formation discipline under fire that would scatter any other unit. They accept losses, but continue toward target. Their gunners are accurate and aggressive. This was grudging respect, not mockery, but Knocke was observing experienced crews on short penetration missions. The real test would come when American bombers pushed deeper into Germany, beyond fighter escort range, where Luftwaffe controllers could mass overwhelming force against them. That test began in earnest in January 1943, when 8th Bomber Command commenced operations against strategic targets in occupied Europe. The mission profile was brutal. Take off from English bases before dawn, form up over the channel in formations of 18 to 21 aircraft, climb to bombing altitude between 23,000 and 27,000 feet, proceed to target through whatever opposition the Luftwaffe could throw up, drop bombs through Flak, turn for home, and survive the withdrawal with German fighters pursuing all the way back to the coast. Round-trip times ran 6 to 8 hours. Temperatures at altitude reached minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Oxygen systems had to function perfectly, or crews would succumb to hypoxia, and the Luftwaffe, watching from radar stations along the coast, could vector fighters to intercept points with precision. The January 27th mission to Wilhelmshaven demonstrated both American determination and German tactical evolution. 64 B-17s attacked the submarine pens through heavy flak and sustained fighter attacks. The Luftwaffe put up approximately 50 fighters, Bf-109s and Fw-190s from multiple Gauchwater and attacked in waves. The first wave hit the formation head-on, a tactic Egon Mayer had refined based on earlier observations. The bombers were climbing toward their initial point, still configuring for the bomb run, when Fw-190s from JG-1 rolled into attack runs from 12 o'clock high. Closing speed exceeded 500 miles per hour. The German pilots aimed for the cockpit and engines, fired 3-second bursts from their 20mm cannons and 13mm machine guns, then broke away down and to the side before the bombers' defensive fire could track them effectively. The attacks were devastating. One B-17 from the 306 bomb group took 20mm hits in the cockpit that killed the pilot instantly and wounded the co-pilot. The aircraft fell out of formation, and trailing bombers watched it spiral down through 20,000 feet before German fighters finished it with stern attacks. But the formation continued. Damaged aircraft held position. Crews with wounded members redistributed responsibilities and pressed on. The bomb run commenced exactly as briefed. Straight and level, bomb bay doors open, bombardier controlling the aircraft through the Norden bomb site while Flak burst around them. The Germans found this incomprehensible. Standard doctrine held that aircraft taking damage would abort. Pilots whose windscreens were shattered, whose engines were burning, whose hydraulic fluid was streaming back across the wings. These pilots should be diving for cloud cover, not maintaining formation and bombing altitude. But the Americans didn't break. They rode their crippled aircraft through the flak, dropped their bombs, and turned for home. 3 B-17s went down over the target. 5 more sustained damage so severe that crews abandoned them over the channel or crash-landed on return. But 56 aircraft returned to base, and photo reconnaissance showed significant damage to the submarine facilities. The Luftwaffe studied the mission results and drew 2 conclusions. First, frontal attacks worked. They disrupted formations, killed pilots and bombardiers, and forced bombers out of defensive position where they could be finished with conventional stern attacks. Second, the Americans would not be deterred by losses. 8 Bomber Command was prepared to accept 5 to 10% losses per mission, which meant the Luftwaffe would have to inflict those losses consistently, mission after mission, to achieve attrition that would force operational pauses. What they didn't know was that Boeing was already modifying the B-17 design to address the frontal attack vulnerability, and that American industrial capacity would soon be producing bombers faster than the Luftwaffe could shoot them down. Through the spring and early summer of 1943, the missions continued with increasing intensity and deeper penetration. Bremen, Kiel, Wilhelmshaven, Antwerp. The target list expanded as 8th Bomber Command built strength and refined tactics. Each mission taught lessons about formation flying, defensive gunnery, and aircraft survivability. Crews learned that tight formations maximized overlapping defensive fire, but made collision avoidance harder in combat. They learned that oxygen discipline was life or death at 25,000 feet. A single failed regulator could incapacitate a gunner in minutes. They learned that 20mm cannon strikes sounded different from machine gun hits, that the smell of hydraulic fluid meant potential control failure, that fire in the No. 2 engine could spread to the wing root in less than a minute, and they learned that the B-17 could absorb punishment that seemed impossible. Aircraft returned to English bases with entire sections of tail shot away, with engines missing, with hundreds of holes in wings and fuselage. Ground crews counted damage and shook their heads. The aircraft should have fallen from the sky, but somehow pilots had kept them flying. The photographs from these damaged aircraft began circulating among Luftwaffe intelligence officers, and the mockery started to fade. These bombers weren't training targets. They were flying tanks, and destroying them required either catastrophic hits to critical areas or sustained attacks that most fighter pilots couldn't deliver before defensive fire drove them off or fuel ran low. The date, August 17, 1943, marks the watershed in this evolution, the day American confidence in unescorted daylight bombing collided with German defensive capabilities at full strength, and the day the B-17's survivability faced its most severe test. The mission plan called for a double strike. One force would hit the Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg and continue south to bases in North Africa, while a second force would strike the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt and return to England. The concept was sound. Split German defenses, hit two critical bottlenecks in German war production, force the Luftwaffe to divide its fighter strength. But execution went wrong from the start. Weather over England delayed the Schweinfurt force for hours, giving Luftwaffe controllers time to recover and rearm fighters after engaging the Regensburg mission. Instead of facing divided opposition, the Schweinfurt bombers flew into a fully alerted and concentrated defense, and the Luftwaffe, having refined frontal attack tactics over 8 months, was ready to demonstrate just how effective those tactics had become. Captain Robert Morgan, leading the 91st Bomb Group's High Squadron, crossed the Dutch coast at 11:23 hours with 230 B-17s in formation around him. The P-47 Thunderbolt escorts that had accompanied them across the channel peeled away at the limit of their range, waggling wings in farewell, and the bomber formations pressed on alone. Ahead lay 280 miles of hostile territory, defended by approximately 300 Luftwaffe fighters drawn from every available Geschwader within range. The German plan was simple: mass attacks from the front to break up formations, then individual fighters picking off damaged stragglers as they fell behind. The first fighters appeared at 11:34 hours, FW-190S from JG-1, climbing into position 8 miles ahead of the lead formations. They formed into line abreast at 28,000 feet, slightly above the bombers, and rolled into coordinated head-on passes. Morgan watched them come, counted 12 aircraft in the first wave, and keyed the intercom. Fighters, 12 o'clock high, coming in. Gunners, track and fire as they close. The range collapsed from 2 miles to 1,000 yards in seconds. The Focke-Wulfs grew from dots to recognizable aircraft profiles, squared wingtips, radial engines, yellow noses of Luftwaffe theater markings. At 800 yards, the top turret gunner opened fire. Tracers reached out, fell short. Other bombers joined in, filling the air between formations and fighters with streams of .50 caliber fire. The Germans didn't waver. They bored in, their own weapons sparking from wings and engine cowlings, and at 400 yards the closing speed meant neither side could miss. 20-millimeter shells walked through the formation. One B-17 in the lead element took hits in the number 1 engine and cockpit simultaneously. The engine exploded in flames. The aircraft snap-rolled left, collided with its wingman, and both bombers tumbled out of formation trailing fire and debris. The German fighters flashed past underneath, close enough that gunners could see pilot faces. Then they were gone, diving away to circle for another pass. The entire engagement lasted 8 seconds. 2 bombers destroyed, 1 damaged, and falling behind. And this was just the first wave. The attacks continued without pause for the next 40 minutes. FW-190S and BF-109S struck from every angle, but the majority pressed home frontal attacks, exploiting the B-17F's weak nose armament. The bomber formations absorbed the punishment and pressed on, but the cost mounted with each passing minute. Aircraft fell out of formation with smoking engines, shattered cockpits, dead pilots. Some fell in controlled glides, crews bailing out through escape hatches. Others simply exploded, 20mm strikes hitting bomb loads or fuel tanks in exactly the wrong place. The survivors tightened up, closing gaps in the formation, maintaining the geometric precision that gave them overlapping defensive fire. Morgan's aircraft took hits 12 minutes into the fighter attacks. A 20mm shell burst against the No. 3 engine nacelle, shredding cooling baffles and puncturing oil lines. The engine temperature climbed rapidly. The co-pilot feathered the propeller, shutting down the engine before it could catch fire, and Morgan adjusted throttles on the remaining 3 engines to maintain position. The B-17 handled differently now. Asymmetric thrust trying to pull them into a slight yaw, but it was manageable. 3 engines provided enough power. They stayed in formation. At 12:08 hours, another wave of fighters appeared ahead. Mi-110 twin-engine heavy fighters from ZG-26, carrying 21-centimeter rockets. These aircraft hung back at 2,000 yards outside the range of defensive machine gun fire and lobbed their rockets into the bomber formations. The rockets were unguided, inaccurate, but their warheads could destroy a B-17 with a near miss. Morgan watched contrails snake toward the formation, tried to judge trajectory, realized there was nothing he could do. The formation couldn't take evasive action during the bomb run. They flew straight and absorbed whatever came at them. 2 rockets detonated in the formation ahead. One missed cleanly, exploding 200 feet below the bombers. The other clipped a B-17's wing, shearing off 10 feet of outboard section. The aircraft rolled inverted and fell away. Then they were over Schweinfurt and the Flak opened up. German 88mm batteries surrounding the ball-bearing plants had exact altitude and heading information. They didn't need to bracket the formations. They put up a barrage at 27,000 feet exactly where the bombers would be, and the lead formations flew straight into it. The sky turned black with shell bursts. Shrapnel ripped through aluminum skin, shattered plexiglass, shredded control cables. The sound was continuous thunder, punctuated by the sharp crack of near misses. Morgan felt multiple hits shake the aircraft, heard the ball turret gunner report hydraulic fluid streaming from the wing, felt the control column go momentarily mushy as shrapnel cut through one set of elevator cables. The backup cables held. They stayed in the sky. The bombardier called out, "Bomb bay doors open." "I have the aircraft." The B-17 was on autopilot now, controlled by the Norden bomb site as the bombardier made final corrections for wind and altitude. This was the moment of maximum vulnerability. 30 seconds of straight, level, predictable flight while bombs dropped away and the aircraft couldn't maneuver. The flak increased in intensity. Fighters, having pulled back during the flak barrage to avoid friendly fire, circled at distance waiting for the formations to turn for home. Morgan watched altitude hold steady at 27,000 feet, watched airspeed drop slightly as bomb bay doors created drag, watched his element lead's bomb release and counted seconds until their own bombs fell free. The aircraft lurched upward, suddenly 6,000 pounds lighter, and the bombardier announced, "Bombs away. Clear." The turn for home began immediately. The lead navigator brought them around in a wide arc, heading northwest toward the coast 280 miles distant. The flak diminished as they cleared Schweinfurt's defensive perimeter, but the fighter attacks resumed with renewed intensity. The Luftwaffe knew the bombers were damaged, knew they'd expended ammunition during the inbound leg, knew fuel was running low for the wounded aircraft struggling to maintain formation. This was when the kills came easiest, picking off stragglers, attacking aircraft that had fallen behind the protective fire of the main formation. Morgan's element stayed tight, but behind them, across the scattered stream of returning bombers, individual B-17s fought lonely battles against multiple attackers. One aircraft from the 381st Bomb Group, its No. 2 engine shot out over the target, fell 2 miles behind the main formation. 6 FW-19s swarmed it, attacking in sequence from different angles, giving the gunners no chance to concentrate fire. The tail gunner expended his ammunition first, then the ball turret, then the waist guns. When the fighters realized the bomber's defensive fire had ceased, they closed in methodically and shot it to pieces. The aircraft held together for 3 minutes under. Sustained fire, testimony to its structural strength, but eventually the port wing failed and the B-17 rolled into a terminal spin. 3 parachutes emerged. 7 men went down with the aircraft. Morgan's 3-engine bomber stayed with the formation, burning fuel at an elevated rate to maintain speed on reduced power. The navigator calculated they'd reach the coast with approximately 45 minutes of fuel remaining, enough to cross the channel and find an English airfield, assuming no further damage. At 13:17 hours, crossing back over the Dutch border, the last fighter attacks broke off. The FW-19s and BF-10-9s peeled away, short on fuel themselves, and the bomber stream proceeded toward the coast unmolested. But the damage assessment was devastating. Of 230 bombers that struck Schweinfurt, 36 had been shot down, a 15.6% loss rate. Another dozen aircraft sustained damage so severe they'd never fly again. And nearly every surviving bomber carried battle damage requiring days or weeks of repair work. The Luftwaffe pilots returning to their bases that afternoon believed they'd proven that American daylight bombing was unsustainable. A 15% loss rate per mission meant bomber crews couldn't complete their required 25 mission tours. The mathematics showed average survival at only 15 missions at this attrition rate. And the Americans had achieved only modest damage to the ball-bearing plants despite the cost. Luftwaffe intelligence reports concluded that a few more missions like Schweinfurt would force 8th Bomber Command to abandon daylight operations or accept casualties that would break crew morale. But what the German pilots and intelligence officers missed in their analysis was what happened when those damaged bombers reached England. Morgan's B-17 landed at Bassingbourn at 15:43 hours with 35 minutes of fuel remaining. The ground crew counted 87 holes in the aircraft from flak and cannon fire. The number 3 engine was destroyed. The hydraulic system was compromised. One main gear strut had been hit and required replacement. But the aircraft had made it home, had protected its crew, and could be repaired and returned to service within a week. Across England that afternoon, similar scenes played out at dozens of airfields. Aircraft that should have been lost landed safely. Crews walked away from damage that should have been fatal, and the Luftwaffe's confidence in their victory began to erode with each photograph of catastrophically damaged B-17s that somehow survived. If you're still here, thank you. Please consider subscribing so more people can discover these stories from history. The technical reports from Schweinfurt mission analysis changed how both sides viewed the B-17's capabilities. American engineers studied the damage patterns and made modifications. They reinforced tail structure, which often failed under repeated 20mm hits. They added armor behind pilot seats, protecting against frontal attacks. They expedited production of the B-17G with its improved nose armament. But more importantly, they documented how aircraft absorbed damage and continued flying, which systems failed, which held, what represented truly critical hits versus dramatic but survivable damage. This data fed back into training, maintenance procedures, and tactical employment. The Luftwaffe technical intelligence drew different conclusions. Their after-action reports noted that killing a B-17 required either catastrophic structural failure, wings or tail shot completely off, or killing the pilots. Killing the engines wasn't enough. The aircraft flew on 3, even on 2 under certain conditions. Holding the fuselage wasn't enough. Crews survived in unpressurized compartments at 27,000 feet despite dozens of penetrations. Even destroying the control surfaces often wasn't sufficient. Pilots managed emergency returns with partial controls. The reports recommended concentrating all fire on the cockpit during frontal attacks, the only tactic virtually certain to destroy the bomber. But executing that tactic required extraordinary marksmanship at closure rates exceeding 500 miles per hour, and it exposed the fighter pilot to concentrated return fire during the critical approach seconds. Through the autumn of 1943, the air war over Germany intensified as both sides adapted. The introduction of the B-17G in September provided the improved nose armament that German pilots had hoped wouldn't arrive. The chin turret changed the mathematics of frontal attacks dramatically. Lieutenant Heinz Knoke, now an experienced fighter leader with multiple bomber kills, recorded in his diary after his first encounter with G-model fortresses, "The new variant has twin guns and a power turret beneath the nose." Frontal attacks now face coordinated fire from this turret and handheld weapons. We lost 2 aircraft from my Staffel in a single pass. The previous advantage has evaporated. The Luftwaffe responded by modifying tactics yet again. If frontal attacks had become too costly, they'd revert to stern attacks, but with heavier armament. The AW190A-8 variant entering service mounted 4 20mm cannons plus 2 13mm machine guns, devastating firepower, but the additional weight reduced speed and climb rate. Other fighters carried 30mm Mk108 cannons, slow-firing but capable of destroying a B-17 with 3 or 4 hits. The problem was these heavy weapons required close range, 500 yards or less, to be accurate, and closing to that range through the bomber's defensive fire exacted a heavy toll on attacking fighters. The real transformation came not from modifications to the bombers themselves, but from changes in escort doctrine. The P-47 Thunderbolt had been escorting raids since spring 1943, but its range limited protection to the Dutch border. In the autumn, drop tanks extended P-47 range to 375 miles, reaching well into Germany. Then, in December 1943, the P-51 Mustang arrived with its Packard-built Merlin engine and range approaching 850 miles with drop tanks. For the first time, American fighters could escort bombers all the way to targets deep in Germany, Berlin, Leipzig, Schweinfurt, on a return mission. The appearance of long-range escorts changed everything about the Luftwaffe's defensive calculations. Previously, German fighters could position carefully, attack at optimal angles, disengage when necessary, and refuel for additional passes. With escorts present throughout the mission, German fighters had to fight through the P-51s to reach the bombers, engage under time pressure before the escorts intervened, and accept combat at a disadvantage since the P-51 was faster, more maneuverable, and better suited to high-altitude combat than most Luftwaffe fighters. The FW-190, which had dominated at medium altitudes, struggled above 25,000 feet, where the thin air reduced its radial engine's power. The Bf-109G performed better at altitude but was outclassed by the Mustang in most performance categories. The second raid on Schweinfurt, launched October 14, 1943, demonstrated the new reality before long-range escorts were fully operational. The mission profile mirrored the August raid: deep penetration, maximum effort, attacking a target the Luftwaffe had to defend. The Germans knew Schweinfurt's importance and massed every available fighter to intercept. The result was the costliest single mission of the war for 8th Bomber Command. 60 B-17s lost out of 291 dispatched, a 20% loss rate. But even in this catastrophic mission, the B-17's survivability was evident. Of the 231 bombers that returned, 142 sustained battle damage, more than 60% of the returning force had been hit, yet they'd survived. Crews reported FW-19s making 8, 10, 12 attack passes on individual aircraft, expending all ammunition trying to kill stubborn bombers that refused to go down. One B-17 from the 305th Bomb Group, the Forbidden Fruit, absorbed over 200 hits from cannon and machine gun fire. Its number 4 engine was destroyed. Number 3 was running rough. The oxygen system was compromised. The tail section was held on by a handful of longerons, and the aircraft had lost to pressurization. The pilot, Lieutenant Robert Sanders, kept it in formation through the bomb run, nursed it across the channel on 2 engines, and crash-landed at the first available field with half the crew suffering from hypoxia. The aircraft was written off as unrepairable, but the crew survived. When German intelligence officers reviewed gun camera footage showing Forbidden Fruit absorbing sustained fire and remaining airborne, the footage was initially dismissed as impossible. Only when cross-referenced with multiple pilot reports was the damage assessment accepted as accurate. What they didn't know, what none of them could have imagined in those dark weeks of October 1943, was that within 6 months, the balance would shift irreversibly. The P-51 Mustang would arrive in numbers, providing continuous escort throughout missions. The B-17G would prove its worth against frontal attacks, and American industrial production would overwhelm German capacity to replace fighters and pilots. The Luftwaffe would be forced into a defensive campaign it couldn't win, bleeding experienced pilots in battles against ever-increasing bomber streams protected by escorts that hunted German fighters aggressively. Through the winter of 1943 to 44, the missions continued relentlessly. Berlin, Brunswick, Frankfurt, Stuttgart. The target list expanded as 8th Bomber Command grew to over 1,000 heavy bombers operational. The Luftwaffe fought desperately, introducing new tactics and weapon systems. They tried standing off at long range with rockets. They tried massing fighters for overwhelming attacks on single combat boxes. They tried ramming attacks by specially formed Sturmgruppen, equipped with heavily armored FW-190s, meant to close through defensive fire and destroy bombers by collision if necessary. Each tactic achieved temporary success but couldn't change the strategic. Mathematics. American aircraft production in 1944 reached 16,000 B-17s alone. German fighter production couldn't match those numbers. And more critically, German pilot training couldn't replace experienced air crews at the rate the Allies were destroying them. The mission over Berlin on March 6, 1944, exemplified the new reality. Over 700 heavy bombers struck the German capital, escorted by more than 800 fighters, P-47s, P-51s, and P-38 Lightnings flying relay escort in sections. The Luftwaffe put up approximately 200 fighters, less than a third of the escort strength. The bombers lost 69 aircraft, a harsh number but sustainable given the force size, less than 10% losses. More significantly, the Luftwaffe lost 66 fighters, and those pilots were irreplaceable. The experienced fighter leaders who'd mocked the B-17s in 1942 were dead, missing, or grounded with injuries. Their replacements had 50 to 100 hours of flight time compared to 200 to 300 hours for earlier generations. They lacked the skill to execute frontal attacks effectively, the judgment to manage fuel and ammunition efficiently, the tactical awareness to survive against aggressive P-51 pilots hunting them throughout the mission. The mockery had ceased entirely by spring 1944. Luftwaffe intelligence reports focused not on the B-17's vulnerabilities, but on its capabilities. How to kill it efficiently. What weapons were required? Which approach angles offered any chance of success? The aircraft German pilots had dismissed as training targets was now feared as nearly invulnerable. Frontline fighter pilots knew the truth. A B-17 in formation with healthy engines and competent crew was extraordinarily difficult to destroy. It absorbed hits that should be fatal. It maintained formation position despite damage, and now it was protected by escorts that made attacking it a death sentence for many German pilots. Technical analysis from late war documents shows the evolution of German respect for the B-17's design. A Luftwaffe tactical bulletin from April 1944 notes, "The American heavy bomber demonstrates survivability characteristics that exceed theoretical predictions. Multiple 20mm cannon strikes to non-critical areas do not ensure destruction. Structural failure is rare even with extensive damage. Recommend concentration of all available firepower on individual targets rather than distributing fire across formations." This was the same Luftwaffe that had mocked the bombers 18 months earlier, now acknowledging they'd underestimated both the aircraft and the men who flew it. The culmination of this transformation appeared in D-Day operations and the subsequent campaign across France. On June 6, 1944, more than 1,000 B-17s participated in airborne operations over Normandy, bombing coastal defenses, transportation networks, and German reinforcement routes. The Luftwaffe's response was negligible, fewer than 100 sorties against overwhelming Allied air superiority. The bombers flew with near impunity, their toughness and survivability no longer tested because German fighter forces had been systematically destroyed in the spring campaign. The aircraft that was supposed to be vulnerable to coordinated fighter attacks now operated in an environment where those attacks couldn't materialize because the fighters didn't exist in sufficient numbers. One final mission exemplifies the B-17's earned reputation for survivability and the distance traveled from the mockery of a 1942. On February 3, 1945, a B-17G from the 379th Bomb Group, the Old Bird, sustained catastrophic damage during a mission over Berlin. An 88mm flak burst severed most of the tail section, leaving the tail gunner's compartment attached by only the upper longerons and some control cables. The entire assembly twisted 45 degrees out of alignment. The pilot, Captain Harry Johnston, had no elevator authority and minimal rudder control. The bomber should have broken up immediately. Standard procedure called for immediate bailout. Johnston instead assessed the situation, determined the aircraft was controllable using throttles and trim tabs, and flew at 400 miles back to England. He landed at emergency speed, touching down at 140 miles per hour instead of the normal 110, and ground-looped deliberately to avoid overshooting the runway. The crew walked away. Photographs of Old Bird, with its nearly severed tail, became famous throughout the 8th Air Force, concrete proof of what crews had known for months. The B-17 could survive damage that would destroy any other aircraft. German pilots who encountered formations in early 1945 found themselves facing aircraft they couldn't defeat. The technical superiority was gone. Allied fighters dominated the sky. The numerical advantage was gone. Bomber streams, numbered 1,200 to 1,500 aircraft escorted by 800 to 1,000 fighters. And the psychological edge was gone. Attacking a B-17 now meant near certain death from escorts. And even if you reached the bombers, killing one required perfect marksmanship and extraordinary courage to close through massed defensive fire. The pilots who'd laughed at training targets in 1942 were gone. The pilots flying in 1945 viewed B-17 formations with dread. The statistics tell the story of this transformation. In 1942, the Luftwaffe achieved approximately one bomber destroyed for every 150 rounds of 20mm ammunition expended. By 1944, that ratio had degraded to one bomber per 800 rounds. The B-17 hadn't become harder to hit. If anything, the larger formations made hitting them easier. But it had proven nearly impossible to kill with anything short of concentrated sustained fire, and Luftwaffe pilots rarely survived long enough to deliver that volume of fire. The aircraft's redundancy, robust structure, and self-sealing systems meant that damage had to be overwhelming and precisely targeted to ensure destruction. The final accounting shows that of 12,731 B-17s built, 4,735 were lost in combat. That's a 37% loss rate, but spread across more than 290,000 sorties, it represents a loss rate of approximately 1.6% per mission, extraordinarily low for an aircraft operating in the most hostile environment imaginable. More than 100,000 crewmen flew in B-17s during the war. Their survival rate depended entirely on the aircraft's ability to absorb damage and keep flying. Tens of thousands of men owed their lives to Boeing's engineering decisions, to the redundant systems that kept shot-up aircraft flying, to the structural strength that held together under punishment that should have caused catastrophic failure. The mockery ended because reality intervened. The Luftwaffe entered the war against American daylight bombing with confidence born from success against other opponents. They learned, mission by mission, that the B-17 represented a new category of aircraft, one designed from the beginning to survive in defended airspace, to absorb battle damage, to bring crews home despite wounds that would doom lesser designs. The transformation from contempt to respect to fear took 18 months and cost both sides dearly. But by war's end, no one in the Luftwaffe questioned the Flying Fortress's capabilities. They'd learned through experience, paid for in blood and wreckage, that the ungainly bomber they'd mocked was the most survivable combat aircraft of the war. The B-17's legacy extended far beyond World War II. Post-war bomber design incorporated lessons learned from its operational service. Redundant systems became standard. Survivability received equal weight with performance, and structural robustness was valued alongside speed and payload. The aircraft that Luftwaffe pilots dismissed as a training target established the template for strategic bombers that followed, from the B-52 to modern designs still in service. Its influence appears in every military aircraft specification that prioritizes bringing crews home, in every redundant system that keeps damaged aircraft flying, in every design decision that accepts weight penalties to increase survivability. The men who flew and maintained the B-17 knew its worth before the war ended. They'd lived through missions where only the aircraft's toughness stood between them and death at 27,000 feet. They'd nursed crippled bombers home on 2 engines, landed aircraft with tail sections held on by cables and prayers, walked away from damage that looked unsurvivable. They never doubted. But watching the Luftwaffe's attitude change from mockery to grudging respect to outright fear validated what they'd known from the beginning. They were flying the right aircraft for the mission, and its capability to survive would ultimately prove decisive in the air war over Europe. If you found this story worth your time, a like genuinely helps others discover it. Please subscribe and hit notifications. We're bringing these forgotten missions and the men who flew them back into the light. Real stories, real people, no Hollywood exaggeration. Drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. United States, UK, Canada, Australia, and if someone in your family served in these wars, we'd be honored to hear about it. These men and their actions deserve to be remembered accurately. Thank you for listening and for keeping their memory alive.